On this episode of the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, we're kicking off season 4. We're back at the playground. We are going to talk through what to expect in this season, and we're going to walk through what we learned in the post-summer pulse check that we just did with camp leaders like you. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, where we turn numbers into stories and data into insights. We dive deep into theology and research, paired with practical wisdom and action steps to help camping ministries thrive. I'm your host and producer, Jared Rendell, a camp enthusiast and part of the Sacred Playgrounds team. This podcast features Dr. Jake Sorensen, a scholar, author, practitioner, and the founder of Sacred Playgrounds. Be sure to subscribe, submit a question to us to be featured on the podcast, and click that support button to help make these episodes happen. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sacred Playgrounds or at sacredplaygrounds.com. Wonder with us what God might have in store at your sacred playground. There we are. Welcome to the playground, everyone, or back to the playground if you've been a listener before. We are here. It's the season 4 kickoff. Hi, Jake.
Hey, Jared. Season 4. That's amazing. It seems like we're getting old or something like that.
You watch your mouth. You watch your mouth. Yeah. I think we ended up talking in the last one, like I turned, now 41 this last year, and I feel 41 and then sometimes these days.
Young at heart,
here we are,
friend.
season
Young
4.
At heart.
That's right. We'll stay like that. Season 4. We're excited to be with you, everyone. Listeners, welcome back. If you have been listening before, and if you happen to be new, welcome. I'm Jared Rendell. I get to co-host and produce this podcast. I serve on the Sacred Playgrounds team as the Director of Communications and Innovation, which all means that I'm a big camp nerd, just like Jake. But like us and our team, I love seeing camp thrive. Have been blessed to be part of, some different camp staffs and other, connected organizations and things like that. So I will be one of the voices that you will hear pretty much every time on this podcast. And this, my friends, is Jake.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jake Sorensen. I am the director and the lead researcher at Sacred Playgrounds. And I've been involved in camp and church ministries for quite a few years at different camps, at different congregations. And so I'm an enthusiast and love to support camp leaders and develop partnerships between camps and churches and families. And so that's a big part of my passion. And research is one of those avenues that we found an area of need. And so that's been a big focus of ours, along with training and resourcing and equipping leaders. And so really excited to be doing things like this podcast and so many other things in academia and in the practical world.
Yes, my friend. So again, in case this is your first time, so Jake and I are part of the team of Sacred Playgrounds. This is something that Jake founded a good few years ago now. Jake's wife, Reverend Anna Sorensen, is on the team as well, keeping our operations going. Kelsey Blinn, our friend Kelsey, who just had a baby recently and is just kind of coming back into doing things like that, coordinates along with Jake and Anna too. And even me now a little bit, I get to crunch some numbers with you too. So Kelsey coordinates our research, connects with especially the camps that we are connected with from a research project standpoint. And so that's the main part of the team. We've got some other folks who fill in and help, input data or crunch numbers or make connections, whatever it is. So Sacred Playgrounds does that. It does 3 things. We generate insights, we equip leaders, we connect partners, all because we love camp and want to see camp thrive. So you can find us, as the intro already said, you can find us at sacredplaygrounds.com. Facebook and Instagram are places in social space that we put some things out there. And we're involved with a handful of other projects too that you can find connections to all that at our website. So just in case this is your first time meeting Jake and I, or your first time meeting Sacred Playgrounds, we wanted to give you that quick intro. If we're already friends, it's so good to virtually see you again. All right, it's season 4. Here's our plan for season 4. We just want to share, well, today on the podcast, we're going to do 2 main things. We're going to share quickly what we can expect from season 4. And then we did this post-camp pulse check survey, and we're going to walk through the results of that today. It was really fun to see from camp leaders. So let me start by sharing quick what we have plans for on this podcast for the next, well, what is it, 9 months or so? So here we are. First episode right now. We're going to be here every other week. We'll plan on dropping a new episode every other week. Every other Tuesday morning is the plan all the way through May. And then you dive in. Lots of you, most of our listeners are either camp leaders or camp connected, and you're diving into summer things, and you are all in and focused there. And so we take a little break over the summer and do other things. But otherwise, we're here every other week talking about some of what is now, what is coming, especially from a data perspective. And we turn those numbers into stories, and we share some of those stories here on the podcast. So we'll be here every other week. We've got some fresh insights from camp data this summer and how we compare that to the past. Like I said, we've got projects that we're involved in right now, like Rhythms of Faith, that we're one of the main project partners there. There'll be some episodes sharing that. You can look back at some of the intro and the launch of that from last season, because that started in the midst of last season, and some other projects that are interesting on leadership and young leadership development and staffing connected things that we're going to re-talk through. So that's the plan. We also are going to share a quick camp question. Every time we meet, we're going to share at least one kind of stat of the week, if not more, every week. So that's our plan for season 4. Jake, what are you excited about this season?
I'm excited about all of the new insights that we get to share, because we're involved in so many projects right now, and we've gathered so much data over the summer, and we've got so much that we're continuing to gather this fall. There are lots of new insights for camp, and camp is really turning a corner again after the COVID pandemic and really starting to grow and think innovatively and do all sorts of new stuff. So really excited about diving into some of those things and walking alongside the leaders.
Amen. We're already going to see some of that today, which I think is interesting, because in a minute here, we're going to dive into this results from this post-camp pulse check. So here's what we did. We sent out a quick survey. It was 6 quick questions to camp leaders. Hopefully you got a chance to fill that out. And we got 61 responses from leaders like you. And we just asked some simple questions about how our summer was, how we're doing, and what were some really good things, what were some things that were challenges. We're going to talk through all that today. It was already interesting in lots of ways. One, just we always like seeing how you're doing, leaders. How are you yourself personally? We're really interested in that. And then the change, even, right, to your point, we're turning a corner. The change even between some of the things, for example, that a lot of people put as their biggest struggles last summer and the summer before, they identified those as either threats or things like that, are some things that are creeping into strengths and successes right now. That's interesting. And so our plan is to talk through those things. We've got there were 4 main questions that we'll talk through the results of today, and we'll walk right down those. That's the plan. Before we do that, like we're going to do each time we gather, we're going to ask our quick camp question. So here's what this is. This is a segment that we do each time we gather. And it's a question that's come from a camp leader or a camp connected person like you. And so this is one of the questions that came in this pulse check. We collected all these questions. You asked amazing questions. We'll share the themes from those questions in a little bit here. This was one because it felt super campy. And my own one of my kids has been on a steady stream of like CeraVe anti-itch after the mosquitoes were crazy. So it had me thinking about bugs. And this question had a question about bugs, maybe a little metaphorically, but so we're going to ask our quick camp question. Quick camp. All right, Jake, here's the question. How do we overcome the dislike of bugs? Now, you can't see this, everybody, but I'm putting bugs in quotation marks because the idea is that bugs is a bit of a metaphor for like these rustic, outdoorsy things. How do we overcome the dislike of bugs as more and more kids come from urban or suburban and fancy pants mindsets? How do more rustic camps that might feel less desirable to at least some of those campers, what do we do with that? How do we wrestle with that?
Thanks for this question. What's funny about this question is it's like an age-old question that goes back to the very beginning of camping ministry. And so you can see some of the people writing in the early 20th century like the 19-aughts about how some camps are getting too posh and they're getting too nice and they got to be more rustic. And so there's this little bit of
Interesting.
rivalry between camps that are more rustic or less rustic or more in touch with the wilderness. And what
Sure.
we have to remember is context really, really matters. And so our tolerance for the outdoors or for bugs, let's use that as our overarching idea, really does depend on where we come from, right? And so when I served at a camp in
Right.
New Jersey and had kids coming from Hoboken, New Jersey, right outside of New York, it was a scary place. And just the cricket noises or the bug noises at nights, the cicadas and things like that, that was a frightening sound.
Sure.
Whereas something like traffic noise and sirens would be a more comforting sound. And so it depends on what we're used to. And so some of the young people who come to camp are very accustomed to the suburban sounds or the urban sounds. And so it's going to be different. It's going to bring us outside of our comfort zone. So there's a couple things to remember. One, being outside of our comfort zone is okay. And we want to encourage that. And that's something that camp does. And so I strongly encourage camp to lean into their outdoor identity, lean into the wilderness identity, and as much as possible, bring kids at least a few steps closer to that wilderness. Now that's going to be different. This is the second thing to remember. It's going to be different for the different kids, right? Some of them, kids that grew up on a farm, they're not going to be all that impressed at your gardening project and your compost project at camp, right? Because that's not going to be as novel to them. They might need a little more diving into the wilderness in order for it to be novel and to bring them outside their comfort zone. And other kids aren't going to need that much. And so really understanding your context and your clientele is going to be super important. And understanding that for some of these kids, just being outside, just having a walk in the woods, even if it is a nice groomed trail, is what they need. And that's that next step towards reconnecting with the outdoors and the wilderness. We don't necessarily need to bring them out of, an urban or suburban life and then dump them into a backpacking trip. Or something like that. So there are different ways of doing this and different balances, but knowing your clientele, listening to your clientele, and not necessarily just pushing all the way back against them, living into your identity as people that live in the outdoors and want to help children connect with the outdoors, but remembering that there are different degrees of connection to the outdoors that these kids already have. And that might bring them out of their comfort zone. So we want to make sure that they feel safe while they're also pushing their comfort zone.
That's helpful. That makes sense. And a good reminder that, knowing our audience is key, period, all the time with whatever it is. A reminder, even as we get to a week of camp or even a retreat coming up or something like that, have that conversation in your intro with the staff and the leaders. If especially if you know more, if you got a whole group from a whole church that's coming from the inner city or something like that, to know that, to remember, that where they're starting is really important. We do that with lots of things when we facilitate things. We facilitate high ropes course. One step up the ladder might be the biggest win. So that's really helpful.
Right. And so things like air conditioning, electricity in cabins, bathrooms in cabins, those are not necessarily a bad thing, folks. It's okay.
Right.
So people are requiring more creature comforts, and that's part of our society, part of our culture, and we can still introduce them to elements of the outdoors at camp, and still lean into that while also providing some of these things that are going to make them more comfortable, especially in the evening times.
Thanks, Jake. All right. Post-camp pulse check. Results time. Let's talk through this survey a bit. So like I said, everyone, we got 61 responses. We kind of put out this post-camp pulse check. Leaders like you filled this out, and it was really fun to see what you had to say, how you're doing, how things went this summer as we look back and think about the last couple and the data that we gathered and the sentiments that we heard and all of that from the last few. This is just really fun for us is my bit of intro. All right, so we're going to walk down these questions kind of like you did. We're going to walk kind of top to bottom on these questions, and Jake will share kind of what we heard. We'll break that down a little bit, talk about it, and we'll go from there. Are you ready, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there should have been a drum roll or something like that. So
let me
here we
see.
go.
Here, ready?
Let's dive in.
Ready?
Okay, I'm ready. Yes. All right. I love it. Thank you so much.
You didn't know there was actually a drum roll drop there. There we go. I'm gonna play with this little media bar a lot this season, I think. Question number one was
Don't give Jared any more toys.
Toys, it's bad. Question number one was an overall question. Overall, how did the summer ministry go for your camp? How did summer ministry go for your camp? Jake, tell us what we heard.
Yeah. So this was really a nice thing to be able to hear from, because we sometimes get to the end of the summer and we're exhausted. We don't feel like the summer went very well. And these last few summers, I was hearing that kind of anecdotally from a lot of my camping colleagues. And this year, when we asked this question, it was overwhelmingly good or great. And so 95% of our respondents said to how did summer ministry go for your camp? They said good or great, 95%. And the other 5% said okay, not so good, or not good at all. But again, that was a very small fraction of the folks. So overall, it was a very successful summer for the people that we heard from. And that is just really awesome to hear. Like, how's everybody doing? We're doing good. We had a good summer. It's great to be able to lead with that. And so I love seeing that in the survey.
Awesome. Agreed. Yeah, that's great news. So we asked, and we care how things are going overall, and we take particular attention to you, leaders. We wanted to know how you were doing. So if you filled this out, we asked question number 2. I'm not going to drum roll every time, Jake. I mean, I could.
That's fine. Yeah.
That's
I just needed that for the intro. Yep.
Perfect. So we asked question 2 is this: how would you describe your current state of being as a camp leader? How would you describe your current state of being as a camp leader? We gave you 5 options. Jake, I'm going to tell them the options quick. Are you energized and invigorated? Are you fresh, normal? Are you tired but not depleted? Are you exhausted and drained? Or are you burnt out? That was the scale of options that we gave folks. Tell us what we heard, Jake.
Yeah. And this again, this is where we see folks turning a corner a little bit in terms of how they're doing at the end of the summer, because there were a lot of folks that really were exhausted and burnt out the last several years. That's why there's been so much mobility in a lot of our camps. And this year, that number was lower. So there were still 20% of folks that said they were either exhausted or burnt out. But a larger proportion, 35, 36, 36% said they were either kind of, hold steady at normal, or they were invigorated, kind of energized for the next thing, which is exciting. That middle category is almost always the largest when we ask this question at the end of the summer. And that's the tired. I'm tired, but I'm not like totally exhausted. I'm tired, but I'm not depleted. And that was 44%. So we kind of see a few more people saying that they're fresh or that they're invigorated than that are saying that they're exhausted or burnt out. And I see that as a positive thing. There's always going to be some people that are exhausted at the end of the summer, because let's face it, the ministry that we're involved with requires a lot of us. It asks so much of us, and we do come through the summer oftentimes exhausted. We also ask this question of summer staff at the end of the summer a lot of times, and those results will be coming in soon. But it's always good to see when the kind of I'm fresh or I'm invigorated, where that number is higher than the number saying that they're exhausted or burnt out. And that's what we had this summer.
Okay, Jake, can I get your take on this? I didn't prep you for this at all, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
Because as we've been camp directors before. One potential point of view coming at this is like, hey, if I'm tired, I did it right. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
The idea that, and I could see this, that we should be exhausted. Exhausted is not the right word, right? It feels like that sometimes. I did it right. I should be, I gave all I had. Sometimes we've seen this before. We've seen this with summer staff where we're like, hey, we're supposed to just drain everything. We're supposed to feel, and I don't know. I'm with you. I don't know that is necessarily the right thing, because we are humans and we need energy to do things and do more and do the rest of life. But I could see where an idea of tired and not depleted, or kind of fresh and normal, feels like what it's supposed to feel like after a long, hard summer that we intentionally packed with camps, with staff, with all this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. And I think you're right. We want to feel like we just came through a really great party. We're tired, but our hearts are full. When we get to the point where we're exhausted or drained or we're burned out, that's where it becomes dangerous, because this ministry has to be
Agreed.
sustainable, and it's not always practiced as sustainable. And I hear from many of our camping colleagues who say, how can I make this sustainable? I love this ministry. I want to give to this ministry, and I do give to this ministry, but I give so much of myself that now I'm unhealthy. And that's where we don't want to get to. And so we really need to practice and teach a culture of care and a culture of support, so that we don't insist on people leaving everything out on the field, so to speak, every week of the summer or at the end of the summer, so that you're so tired that you can't do it again.
Yeah.
We need to make this so it's sustainable. And sustainable not just for, single people who are young and are able to give it all and stay up late at night, but sustainable for people with families. And so sustainable as a career. And that's where it's sometimes really difficult, especially for some of our people in executive positions that really do demand a lot of their second line staff, that the program folks and the associate directors and people like that. We have to develop a culture where this is sustainable and where we're taking good care of our people. And we don't always do that in ministry. And part of that is, the sacrificial language that we talk about, right? Giving of ourselves. Christ gave everything for us. So let's give to each other. And that is true. We want to give to each other, and we don't demand that in our jobs. Our jobs need to be sustainable. And we need people who are able to do this ministry long term. And so we need to take care of them.
Truth. The word sustainable, there's a little preview to later. The word sustainable was the most common word in the questions that we were asked of kind of the key words. Sustainability was the most, was the one that I saw the most. They're talking both about organizational sustainability, but you're right. I mean, it's a bigger term than that. And one of the questions was almost exactly what you said. One of the questions that we got in this survey was a leader asking how do I keep my supervisors from working me to death?
Yeah.
Was the first thing in their mind that they asked. So obviously there's stuff to talk about here with staffing and care, but yes, to your point, we need to have some energy for what's ahead, right? Whether we actually are running year-round programming or not, we've got things to do. And so that's helpful. All right. So that's where we are as leaders. Here's where we're going next. The next two questions, we asked the same set of kind of criteria overall, the same set of categories. And we asked about greatest successes and we asked about greatest challenges. And like I said, it was the same slate of choices for those things. So let's start with successes. Let's start with what is particular in terms of our camp and our operations and our programming is feeling good for this summer. Let's talk about what we heard. So question 3, our greatest successes this summer.
What was fun about this one? So this was a multi-select, so you could select up to 3 in terms of what your greatest successes were. And there was a list of, well over a dozen choices. And so the top 5 in terms of successes that people wanted to lift up one was their staff performance. They thought their summer staff did a bang up job this summer, and that's always exciting to hear. Number 2 was program quality. And so this is about 50% for each of these. So 51% for staff performance, 48% for program quality. Who said this was a big success, that our program was awesome this year, was high quality. Number 3, this was an interesting one. And so the number 3 success was staff recruiting and retention. This is a big deal because we've been talking for the last 3+ years about how difficult it's been to recruit summer staff and to retain them for multiple years. And this year, that was one of the top 3 successes. And so that's really great to, we have heard this from people like during recruiting season that it's not as difficult as it was last year. But it's different. There's a difference between saying it's not as terrible as it was the last 2 years and saying this was one of our top successes. And so that a third of our respondents said that staff recruiting and retention was one of their top 3 successes this year is just awesome to hear. The fourth one is also related to staff. And so you'll see that 3 of these top 5 are related to summer staff. And this fourth one was staff training and supporting the summer staff. And we've talked about this so much in this podcast and through our Sacred Playgrounds things, is that our staff need a lot of support, and specifically things like mental health support, and time off, and supervisory support, peer-to-peer support. And so to hear that this was one of the top successes as well, is really, really great. And then the number 5, rounding out the top 5 of successes, were camper numbers. People saying that they had a lot of success with camper recruitment and having camper numbers up, and so that's great to hear. And that was a quarter of you, 25%, said camper numbers were one of the top 5 successes, and so those are the top 5.
There we go. Interesting, like you said, that 3 of those top 5 are staffing related.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I love that. We just know that, and we've said on here multiple times, that summer staff are the heart of our ministries. When
Absolutely.
our primary function is summer camp, and for families, and yes, of course, for kids, when our primary function is summer camp, that those that actually execute that, the heart of that ministry. So that's a great corner to turn.
Mhm.
Awesome. All right. So those were our top 5, and we're going to share, by the way, sidebar, we're going to share some of the graphics, some of the breakdowns graphically of this in kind of an infographic style whole for our stat of the week. It's kind of all stats of the week this week. I don't know. I'll hit that drop sometime maybe, but we've got stats of the summer, I guess, at this time. And so we're going to share all this so you can see kind of even the others and where they kind of fell in line. So let's go to 4. Those were our top 5 successes. Greatest challenges this summer. Question 4, our greatest challenges. Again, they were asked to choose their top 3 from that same slate of possibilities.
Yeah, that's why these numbers don't add up to 100%, obviously, because you can select up to 3. And so what's interesting here is that 2 of those that appear in the top 5 successes also appear in the top 5 challenges. And the number 1 challenge is one of those, and that's camper numbers. And so the number 1 challenge, so 43%, said camper numbers. And so we've got this interesting dynamic where for some camps and camp leaders, camper numbers was one of their top successes of the summer, and some it was one of their top challenges. And so that is a really interesting observation to look at and say, why is this? What's going on? Why are some people having greater success than others? And there's a lot that goes into that, right? But it is important to know that not everybody's doing great right now in terms of camper recruitment, and not everybody's struggling. And so I hear that line a lot, just the kind of the post-COVID line of, well, everybody's struggling right now. We're still trying to get through COVID, and it's just not true. Not everybody is struggling. There are some camps that are doing very, very well, that their camper numbers are back to 2019 levels, and some camps that are at historic highs. And so those are numbers that we're going to be able to look at a little more deeply as we get into the fall, because we're going to do another director survey. And so that'll be coming out in the next few weeks. And so we'll really be able to look at how many camps are up, how many camps are holding steady, how many camps are down. But just to know that some camps are struggling with this and some camps are not. And so there could be some fruitful dialogue among directors about some of the strategies that they're using that are successful in getting their camper numbers up. And so that was challenge number 1. Challenge number 2 is really interesting. So this is partner church engagement. 39% of our respondents said this was one of their top 5 challenges. And what's interesting about this one was it was also the one that had the greatest deficit in terms of a gap between those saying challenge versus success. Partner church engagement, not very many people said this was one of their top successes over the summer, which means that this is something that a lot of people are struggling with, and not a lot of folks were finding particular success with this past summer. And so this is something that we probably want to lean into, especially as we talk about things like the Rhythms of Faith project, which is focused on partnering with families and with partner churches. And so that'll be an interesting one for us to continue to pursue. Number 3 was finances. 31% said that was one of their top 3 challenges. Number 4, in terms of challenges, staff recruiting or retention. Now remember, that was one of the top 5 successes as well. it's also one of the top 5 challenges. Now, 28% said it was one of the top 3 challenges. 34% said it was one of the top 3 successes. So more people were finding success than we're finding it as a challenge, but there are still some folks struggling with staff recruiting and staff retention. And then rounding out the top 5 in terms of the challenges that people identified was site maintenance, site layout, site maintenance, and in a lot of
Those
cases
kind of
deferred
things. Sure.
maintenance. And so 25% said that was one of their top challenges. And so that's again to be expected at, kind of in this time after the pandemic, where some of those things were deferred. Those are some things that people need to turn to, and it's one of those perennial challenges with camps. How do we develop our facilities? And it goes to the quick camp question that we had too, about how do we
Right.
accommodate folks who are expecting greater comfort, and aren't going to be content with an outhouse or a shower house that was built in the 1980s and is kind of gross. How do we accommodate these folks? And that comes to site layout, it comes to maintenance, and it comes to building projects. So those were our top 5, and I do want to add an honorable mention, because 20%.
Sure.
This is number 6. 20% identified camper behavior as one of their top 3 challenges.
Yeah,
and so
that's
I
an
think that's
interesting one.
interesting as we continue to talk about some of the challenges of campers simply being mean to each other, not knowing how to interact with others. It seems like this is getting better as we get farther and farther away from the pandemic lockdowns and social distancing. And it's still one of those top concerns. So that was number 6, in terms of our ranking system here.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, thanks, Jake. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's good to hear those things too. We've both done some coaching in sports and things like that. And my son's team that I coached took a tough loss last week in our first football game, and we reminded them to not waste a loss. Right, so, which is a little similar in this challenge idea. We don't waste these challenges. Right, we want to learn. The only time you waste a loss is when you don't learn from it, right? So for us to look at and go, all right, these were the things that were a challenge. Are there things that we can and should do about these things? And sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's, well, no, we just need to lean into this success and this strength. But to ask the questions is really good. So those were kind of the 4 main questions. Now, what we're going to do now for just a minute is, particularly with those last 2 questions, our success and our challenge, and Jake and those that are doing the research, we try to look a layer deeper, right? Because of course we could just look at, okay, here's this list and how do they stack up, top whatever, and that is valuable. And there are things that you can notice about kind of the juxtaposition and the comparison between data points, especially when you do it like this, when you ask the same or a similar slate of options. So some of what Jake looked at was breaking that down. What are the comparisons between successes and challenges, and what does that tell us? So we're kind of taking a step deeper in terms of how you particularly analyzed these numbers. And so that brought up some things like, where we'll start here. Tell us about, this is a sentiment that helps. Tell us about some of the things that then were sort of the lowest concern for our folks. So this means all these things were below 20% of concern. It wasn't below 20%, not necessarily success or challenge, below 20%, and something that we didn't have a high concern about. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah, so I mean, you look at these things. So they didn't say it was a particular challenge. They didn't say it was a particular success, and so only a very small percentage listed these as the top 3 in either of those categories. So it's a lower concern than the other things during the summer. And so there were 5 of these. One was board engagement and issues related to the board. This is one of those things where, and this goes with all of these. I don't want to overinterpret this, but I also want to admonish folks a little bit that these are important things. Like, I understand that your staff engagement and recruiting might be more on your mind and more important in a lot of ways than your board engagement. And in another sense, board engagement is one of the most important things all the time. And so, did you have particular challenges, particular successes or were you just not caring about engaging your board members? Because we really should be concerned about engaging our board members in the summer ministries and during the summer so that they know what's going on at the camp on the board that they serve. So it's a little concerning that that one is among these. Another one was communication with camper families. People didn't say this was a particular success or a particular challenge. We know from our parent surveys that this is one of the number one concerns among camper parents, that they want better communication. We've talked about this over and over again on this podcast. And so maybe people are just kind of in the middle. They're trying, but they're not having particular success or particular challenge with this. But I'm hoping that it's not because it's something that they're not concerned with or thinking about.
Yeah.
The third of these was one that we labeled navigating social and cultural issues. I hear about these things all the time when I go to conferences, when I talk to camp directors. How are we going to handle this particular cultural issue? And these things change over time, right? And so one of the major ones right now is, how do we accommodate transgender campers? We have, most of our camps are gendered spaces, right? They have female cabins, they have male cabins. And so if we have a transgender camper, how do we accommodate this camper? And trying to figure this out has caused a lot of angst among a lot of our camp professionals, because they want to do it correctly. And it's a challenging thing to figure out in a space that has been traditionally gendered in the past. And what's interesting is that this was not one of the big successes or one of the big challenges. And so as much as I hear about this and hear it presented on at conferences and things like that, this wasn't among the top concerns raised by our respondents. And I thought that was interesting. The other two have to do with fundraising and marketing. So one of them was fundraising and donor engagement, and the other one was marketing. And so I can sort of see where these might be lower concerns, kind of during the summer than the actual running of the ministry. And I think you point out frequently, Jared, in your role, that we're always marketing, and everybody's part of your marketing team. So we don't want this to be one of the lowest concerns. I will say something about marketing, because what was interesting here is there was actually a deficit. So people, there were hardly anybody that said it was one of their greatest successes, but several people said it was one of their greatest challenges this summer. Now, that might be related to the camper numbers and not being able to get their camper numbers up.
Yeah.
But it's also something that's interesting, that this is one of the deficits in terms of many more people said it was a challenge than said it was a success. And so that was marketing. But it was still, again, between challenges and successes, if you add those numbers together, it was still below 20% had this as one of their top three of either one.
Sure. All right. So you started to, those are kind of the lowest concerns, didn't rise to the top really of either. You started to mention something now about this idea of the greatest deficit. And so tell us what you mean by that, and then tell us some of the things that were most significant there.
Right. And so what I mean by a deficit is that the percentage of folks that said this was one of their greatest challenges was higher than the percentage that said it was one of their successes. Mm-hmm. And so we really get a sense. So again, some of these things, like staff recruitment, there was almost an equal number that said this was one of our greatest successes as said this is one of our greatest challenges, right? So that those, if we subtract one from the other, they kind of cancel each other out. But when there's a much higher percentage saying this was our challenge, that's where I would say there's this kind of challenge or success deficit. And so I mentioned this before, that the number one on this list was the partner church engagement. And so it was the highest, or among the highest. It was the number two in terms of the top challenges. And so 39% said this was one of their top challenges during the summer, and a very low percentage said it was one of their top successes. And so this was kind of the highest deficit. Finances was another one that had a huge deficit. More people said this was a great challenge than said that this was a great success. And so that is something that is worth delving into, because with something like staff recruitment, we can partner the people that were having success with the people that were having challenges, and they can talk to each other and get
Sure.
ideas.
Yeah.
When everybody's having the challenge and very few people are having the success, that's where we might need to have some intervention. And so the partner church engagement, the finances, and how to fix some of these financial challenges and problems at our camps. And then number 3 was the site and the maintenance issues. Had a big deficit. 4 was camper numbers. There was a higher number that said it was a challenge than said it was a success.
A challenge.
Although, remember that they were both in the top 5.
It still showed up in the top 5.
Yeah. And then the 5th one, as I said, was marketing. Even though very few people said it was among either their top challenges or their top successes, this was one that had a deficit. So more people said it was a challenge than said it was a success. And so again, that might be directly related to camper numbers.
Yeah. Okay, let's slice this one more way.
Okay.
Talk to us about the greatest positive difference. So it's kind of flipping that idea of deficit, where there was a challenge. It's flipping that, where there was clearly more said this was positive, this was a success, than a challenge. What rose to the top there?
Yeah, the ones that rose to the top here were the ones among the ones that had the greatest successes that we already mentioned. So one was program quality. A large portion of people said this was a big success of ours, and very few said this was a challenge of ours this summer. So nailed that one. Staff performance, which I would argue goes along with program quality. And so because they had success with staff recruitment and staff training and staff performance, program quality rose to the top, right? So when we have struggles with staffing, program quality suffers. And so these things go together. And then the number 3 was the staff training and the support among the staff. And so again, 2 of these are staff related, and the other one, program quality, which was the highest in terms of the positive deviance. That one was is directly related to staff performance and staff training and support. And so those are the things to like really, really celebrate from this summer. And it's great to see these things because we know from so much research that we've done, but also our friends at the American Camp Association related to program quality, that program quality is kind of the number one factor in terms of camper impact. So if you want to have impact on the campers, you got to have a quality program. That's why we lean into our 5 fundamentals of Christian summer camps. That's why ACA, the American Camp Association, is leaning into their program quality initiative right now, helping camps develop higher quality programs so that the campers can have a better experience and they can have a more lasting impact on these campers' lives.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, like I said, we're going to share some of this in a couple different ways. We'll put some of this together in kind of an infographic style. You can share, you can look. What we'd love to hear, everybody, and we've got just one more that we'll talk through in a second, but what we'd love to hear before I share these question themes is hopefully you're doing what I'm doing right now, which is like wrestling through a pile of questions when I hear all those things and trying to contextualize to your own camp. Do that. Contextualize to your own thing. Yes, this was true for us. This wasn't true for us. Oh, the difference between these things is significant for us. If you want to comment on that or send us an email about that or wherever you're hearing this, drop a thought, drop a comment, drop an idea, drop a question, because wrestling with this stuff is a good time, and contextualizing it to your own and figuring out what kind of action steps you might take is a good time. The last, the last main question that we asked of you was around asking for questions. What questions are on your mind about outdoor ministry? Offer as many questions as you can think of, and just go ahead and throw them out there. What we're going to do with these, one, we have and are going to read them, and we're going to use them to think about things for this podcast, for the articles that we write on all the off weeks. We're going to try to answer some of these in different ways. And so we're going to use these to build a lot of the things that we share on this podcast and in other spaces over the course of this season. So these were great questions. You did awesome. You put out a pile of really interesting questions. So we're going to use them. Some of them, like the one today about bugs, are going to probably just as is get featured on this podcast. So if you happen to be the one wondering about bugs, hey, comment, say, hey, that was my question. We'd love to hear that. I wanted to share quick the overall themes of those questions, right? So these are basically, now this was not deep analysis, and we do this. We transcribe and theme all these things. This was a couple of quick glances at what we're hearing in those questions. So there are a few key words that stood out, Jake, and here's what they were. It looks like the most common word and theme in there was about sustainability. Now you brought this up already, but how are we sustainable? How do we make outdoor ministry sustainable is a big question, it looks like, right now. And our ministry and outdoor ministry as a whole. And it was asked in both of those ways in these questions. But that was the key word, was around sustainability, which is interesting. So I think we're going to talk about this more than once. Staffing was another question, as usual, as always, which is okay. We heard some about that, but people kept asking. Recruiting, retention, support. Those were some things around staffing. So there were some staffing things again, of course. And then another, again, not surprising based on what we heard in those success and challenge questions, was around church engagement, engaging with churches. And related to that is what I would maybe call creative constituency, questions around new audiences, new campers. If it can't just be church, then what? Then where? So that's interesting too. So those are some of the main themes that came out of the questions that people are asking. And we're going to break those down.
Nice.
Some more.
Yeah. I'm excited to dive into those in future articles and podcasts.
That's the plan. All right, everyone. Thanks for talking through this with us. This was a really good time for us. This is kind of our wrap on the kickoff. We have got so much more to come in season 4. We've got stats to share. We've got a lot of fun to have in this season. Jake, what else before we close?
And I want to let people know that the Rhythms of Faith project is going strong. We did some site visits this summer. I got to go to 3 different camps. We went to 11 total. So we've got site visit reports that are coming out on the rhythmsoffaith.com website. There's a webinar coming up, Jared. I think that's coming up on
September 19th.
All right.
Correct. That morning. So it's at 11 Eastern, 10, 9, 8. Find that on our social media stuff, and we've got that in our emails too. So make sure you're subscribed there.
Yeah, we'd love to see people there to hear about some of the initial findings. We're going to be sharing these throughout the fall. And one of the things that I'm really excited about, and for our friends that are in Lutheran Outdoor Ministries, United Methodist Camp and Retreat Ministries, or Christian Camp and Conference Association, those are our 3 partner organizations on this grant. We have a request for proposals that is now live. We want you to participate in the longitudinal study. There are sub-grants that are going to be awarded to some folks. So please check that out. That request for proposals can be found on the Rhythms of Faith website. And
rhythmsoffaith.com.
we would really love to have you join us in that. So please apply for those subgrants.
Yeah, that's obviously a big project that we're putting a lot of energy into right now. Rhythmsoffaith.com has all of that, including the button to apply right now, as well as a quick button to just make sure you're getting info on that particular project so you can stay up to date. So join us in that exciting engagement. We've got lots more to share. It's going to be a really fun season. We're grateful to be partnered and in ministry with you, and we want to see you camp leaders thrive and your ministries thrive. So grateful to be with you. We'll see you next time on the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/sacredplaygrounds or at Sacred Playgrounds on Instagram. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you're getting this podcast. And if you like this content and it's helpful, you can support the podcast by clicking that support button. Our theme music was written and performed by Taylor Wilson. You can find all his original songs wherever you get your music. Learn more about what we're up to and connect with the team at sacredplaygrounds.com.